I met the company halfway. Its men were running in a chain along the route of the message. In front, a stocky, broad-shouldered lieutenant, apparently the company commander. Behind him, a medium-sized, thin junior political officer. Coming up to me, the panting lieutenant asked where he could find Combat Komulo. "He is in front of you," I answered, extending my hand to the company. He looked at me incredulously, then at his political officer and said, "Not to jest, Lieutenant. I'm not joking. Yes, I'm the commander. My name is Komulo. Follow me." When we ran up to the right flank, the reserve of my battalion was already occupying the defence there. Akatiev had positioned his men correctly. "Your task, Lieutenant." I turned to the commander of the arriving company and looked at him questioningly. "Lieutenant Skeeden," he understood. "Your company, Lieutenant Skeeden, to take the defence," and showed on the terrain. "And how are things in the first company?" I put my binoculars there. I saw, on its right flank, 2 fascist tanks had already passed over the first trench, and up to a company of enemy infantry was accumulating in front of the passages. Apparently, heavy machine gun and automatic weapons fire still prevents her from getting up and making a decisive throw. Meanwhile, 1 tank, turned on the trench, went along it to the left, and all the time led machine gun fire. Another armoured vehicle, following the first, now and then made turns, piling the trench with earth. Crushing bastards. Tracks. Didn't the company have any anti-tank grenades or Molotov cocktails left? Just flashed such a thought, as the tank walking along the trench caught fire. Its crew began to jump out of the hatches, but accurate bullets of our machine gunners killed the fascist tankers. The second tank, shooting back with machine guns, began to quickly turn back. Well done, First Company. Well done. Beat them, so that others will not be like them," I shouted in joy. The 2nd Rifle Company is also holding on, skillfully repulsing the fierce attacks of the enemy. So, my place is here. After all, the fate of the battalion now largely depends on the situation on the right flank. "Comrade Akatiev," I ordered the adjutant, "quickly to the NP. Tell Brailovsky to give me a connection here. Captain Zhdaneyev should also move his observation post to me." "Yes, sir." And the enemy tanks and infantry, despite the fire of my reserve, continue to hastily pull into the free gap of the junction with our right neighbour, and fall under fire of Lieutenant G.S. Skeedan's company, which had time to take the defence. 1 tank caught fire, then another. The rest, having made a desperate dash, approached the trench and began to irrigate it. But it was not to be. Tanks are unlikely to swamp the trench full profile, especially since the ground was now already frozen. Therefore, the soldiers, who were at the bottom of the trench, were only slightly covered with soil. But when the tank was moving away, they jumped up and pelted it from the stern with grenades and bottles with combustible mixture. Now 4 of the 8 tanks attacking Skeedan's company were hit in a short time. The rest, having overcome the trench, began to move towards the forest. Behind them trudged, escorted by fire, groups of enemy machine gunners. It was all that was left of a full-blooded infantry battalion of the Nazis, and these few managed to leak not through the fighting order of Lieutenant Skeedan's company, but to the right, where there were no trenches. But they did not go far. Soon this broken-through group ran into the defence of the battalion of the 2nd Echelon and was completely defeated. Lieutenant Skeeden came up. His head was bandaged, blood seeped through the bandage. Next, his men brought up to 12 prisoners. I got worried and asked, "How do you feel? Can you continue to command the company or evacuate to the rear?" "It's nothing, a scratch." "Well, go ahead." At that time, Akatiev came running and reported that the regiment commander will conduct a counter-attack by the 2nd Echelon on those Hitlerites, who slightly squeezed our 1st and 2nd companies. Captain Sedik ordered to involve Lieutenant Skeedan's company and our reserve in the counter-attack. This group is ordered to be led by you personally, Comrade Combat. As soon as our artillery opens fire, get up." "I see. Pasha counterattack began together with a short, and for some reason very disorganized artillery attack on the invading enemy. With the first bursts of shells, the 2nd Echelon, 3rd Battalion, went forward. I, too, raised the units temporarily entrusted to me. The enemy artillerymen immediately fired a quick fire on the fighting order of the counterattackers. Gott and my combined group. In order not to suffocate the attack, I decided to rush to withdraw the company and reserve platoons from under the artillery attack. With a pistol in my hand, I overtook the chain that had slowed down, shouting, "For the motherland! Attack! Forward!" And without looking back, I rushed on. I hear the long hurrah again, gaining strength behind me. The artillery shelling seemed to subside for a while. Did we really get through? But I was glad, as it turned out, too early. Here the shells again tore the frozen ground ahead, to the right, to the left of us. It was no other way than to reach a new frontier of immobile barrage of fascist artillery fire. So, we need to rush forward again. I turned to the soldiers running behind me and was going to give another command. But I barely opened my mouth as fire lightning flashed in my eyes, and something hot burned my lower abdomen. My left leg jerked too, as if it had broken beneath me. I flew into some black abyss. I woke up with a strong chill. My mouth was dry, the bandage on my head slipped over my eyes, a rivulet of warm blood ran down the collar of my uniform. My legs, as if they were not mine. I tried to move the fingers of my right hand. They didn't obey. I wanted to pull up my left leg, but a sharp pain went to my head, and I lost consciousness again. I regained consciousness in the dugout. I felt someone unbuttoning my overcoat and belts, and pulling up my overcoat on my stomach. "It's great," came an unfamiliar voice. "Yes, it got him," answered another voice, seemingly even familiar. "But who is it?" Someone tried to remove my boot from my wounded leg, but the sharp pain burned my whole body again. I screamed, as it seemed to me, with all my might. I groaned, poor thing. "So you're awake," said the first voice. "It is necessary to evacuate him to the medical centre immediately." The second familiar voice echoed him. "Let's get the orderlies. Careful. Where's the stretcher? Be careful. Now on the sled." Then someone leaned over me, breath on my face, and a familiar voice asked, "Mikhail, and Mikhail? Can you hear me? It's me, Ivan Ivanovich." "Ah, Ivan Ivanovich, Commissar?" I asked him, with difficulty unclenching my lips. "Where are the fascists? Have you restored the defence?" "The fascists have been repulsed, the defence has been restored, everything is in order," Ivanov answered and shook my hand. This friendly shake, and even more so the words he said, "The fascists have been repulsed, the defence has been restored," brought me a noticeable relief. Even my wounds began to hurt less. And then, when the orderlies were taking me on a sledge to the rear, these words of the Commissar kept ringing in my head. From somewhere, as if from afar, came voices. "Where is the car going?" "To Podolsk." "And you have a wounded man?" "Load it." There are already 2 lying here. Let's put them down. You can fit 4 lying down and half a dozen lightly wounded." And now the car started down the broken old Warsaw highway to Podolsk. On the bumps, the searing pain every time gave in my left leg, in the lower back, in the stomach. And against my will I was moaning. "What, Lieutenant, does it hurt?" asked me one lightly wounded, squatting near the cabin. "Yes, you must have been badly hurt. Under what circumstances?" "This is the same lieutenant who led us in the counterattack," someone answered the questioner. "He was hit right in front of me. A shell exploded almost next to him. I thought that was it. But no, I saw him alive." "What company are you from?" a third voice asked. "The 9th, Lieutenant Skidans." "Then you're wrong, bro. He couldn't have gone with you in a counterattack. He's our battalion commander." "What company are you from?" "2nd." "Well, maybe that's your commander. But only when we came to you from the 2nd Echelon and took the defence, he was with us all the time. And then he led the counterattack. From these warm words of the soldiers again became somehow easier on the soul. And I closed my eyes. My wound turned out to be heavy. I had to spend several months in hospitals. Later, the doctors said that only excellent health and youth helped me to get back into service. After recovery, short-term courses of command staff, assignment of the next military rank, personnel department, and here I am already a battalion commander of the 878th Rifle Regiment of the 290th Rifle Division. The unit to which we were sent, 7 combatants, stood on the formation of 30 to 40 kilometres from the front line. The personnel was stationed in villages whose population had been evacuated to the rear. The division was commanded by Colonel N.A. Dudnikov. His commissar was Senior Battalion Commissar N.I. Bolotov, Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel P.G. Rack. The 290th Infantry was part of the 10th Army, which in the counter-offensive near Moscow, acting on the left wing of the Western Front, struck a blow to the 2nd Tank Group of the enemy in the direction of Stalinogorsk and Bogoroditsk, liberated the Tula industrial region, Kaluga, dozens of other smaller cities and towns. If we talk only about the 290th Division, it had to fight particularly hard in late March, early April 1942, in which it suffered heavy losses. Now, the Chief of Staff of the division told us at the first acquaintance, we are already fully staffed. We are only waiting for the arrival of the rest of the command staff. And there, back to the front, into battle. And indeed, in mid-May, the division took up the defence on the right flank of the 10th Army at the line Shemelinka, Selzo, Kamenka, excluding the town of Kirov, which is in the Kaluga region. In the first echelon were the 882nd and 885th Rifle Regiments. Ours, the 878th, was in the second. The 1st Battalion, which I took under my command, defended the district centre Baryatinskoye, through which ran the railroad Sukinichi, Spas-Demensk. We prepared the settlement and the railway station for a circular defence. The first 2 trenches were equipped on the outskirts of Baryatinskoye. The third, directly in the district centre, including stone houses and cellars in the defence system. The fact that we have not yet conducted active hostilities, I was even pleased. The thing is that the battalion command staff, except for only a few platoon commanders, was completely new, and it took at least some time for us, figuratively speaking, to get used to each other. The battalion commissar, political officer F.S. Chudinovskik, for example, before the war had worked in the district party committee in his homeland, in the Kirov region. Politically he was literate, but in military terms, to put it bluntly, weak. But, it was thought, the battle will teach. The post of Adjutant Senior was quite young Lieutenant Afor Gromov, who had only completed an accelerated course of military school. Adjutant of the battalion was Junior Lieutenant S.P. Zadanovich, a graduate of the front courses. The first company was commanded by Lieutenant F.G. Andreev, and his political officer was Junior Political Officer S.I. Kriksin. The second company was headed by Lieutenant M. I. Tomachek, and Junior Political Officer N. I. Goldobin. The third, Lieutenant 10, I. Fedotov, and Junior Political Officer I. Smirnov. Machine Gun Company was commanded by Lieutenant I. M. Kamenev, and its political officer was Junior Political Officer V. V. Roden. In short, all young, without sufficient combat experience people. All summer we were improving our defence. The enemy almost did not bother us, only occasionally led a sluggish shelling of Baryatinsky and the railroad station, mainly from heavy guns. Therefore, despite the low intensity of artillery fire, he still managed for 3.5 months, almost completely destroyed this settlement. In September, our regiment was replaced on the front line by the 882nd Rifle Regiment, which was withdrawn to the second echelon for rest. It was thought, finally to fight. But instead of that, the trench work, which had already become tiresome. I came to the front line as a communist. Back in May, Chudinovskych, as if by the way, asked me why I still have not joined the party. What to answer? Indeed, already a battalion commander, I rely on communists. I am interested in the work of the party organization and care that the party layer in the companies continuously growing. But myself. You have to apply. I'll vouch for you. I think that the Regiment Commissar Zagorny will also give a recommendation, said Chudinovskych. Well, and the third? We'll find a third recommender, and at the next meeting we'll consider it. So I became a candidate for membership in the All-Union Communist Party, and 3 months later, as it was practiced at the front, I was accepted as a member of the party. Almost simultaneously, in October 1942, I was awarded the regular military rank of captain. So event after event. Meanwhile, radio and newspapers were reporting about fierce battles in Stalingrad, in the North Caucasus, near Leningrad. And we, silence. It's a shame. All we do is to improve our defence. How long will it last? Others are fighting, but by October we dug 3 trenches of full profile, equipped cut-off positions, made communication lines to the rear. We made good dugouts, shelters for heavy weapons, set mine blast barriers in front of the front edge of the battalion's defence and in depth. We were preparing. But for what? The enemy in front of us was still not active. By this time there was a change of commanders. Back in July we were recalled from US Colonel N.A. Dudnikov, and the division took his deputy Colonel Y.M. Prokofiev. It was a combat and very competent commander, awarded 2 orders of the Red Banner. He almost never left the units, conducting there with regimental commanders and combatants classes on tactical training. At the end of September was transferred to another position, and our regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel the 4th Uryupin, and in command of the 878th Rifle, became his deputy Major S.F. Puzirev, also a combat officer, awarded the Order of the Red Star for the defence of Moscow. Soon we were replaced in the defence of the 3rd Battalion, and we became the reserve of the division commander. According to his decision, the battalion took the defence area around Baryatinsky, prepared by us in summer. I equipped my CP in the basement of one of the surviving brick buildings, and the observation post was located in the same house, but only in the attic. On the roof, I ordered to install a stationary machine gun, Maxim, adapting it to shoot at aerial targets. True, the Hitlerites used aviation in our direction very rarely. Apparently, it all operated in the south, where their formations were rushing to Stalingrad and the North Caucasus. But the frame appeared regularly, by hours. Sometimes it would fly over our defences, then expect a fire attack of heavy artillery. But one day, as I remember now, it was a cloudy, foggy morning. A light rain was drizzling. The weather was obviously bad. And suddenly a long machine gun burst on the roof. It was our Maxim. But on what kind of target? I was just shaving at that moment. I opened the door to see what was going on, and I heard shouts from the yard. "It's burning! It's burning!" I ran outside, and I saw a large German transport plane engulfed in flames, which was pulling down towards the outskirts. Soon everything became clear. Olenik, the foreman of the machine gun, was on duty at the machine gun. He heard the airplane coming to our rear behind the clouds. He huddled at the machine gun. But what can you see in such bad weather? The buzz went away, but in a few minutes it came again, already in full force. And suddenly, low and low, already from our rear, appeared a plane with a swastika. The petty officer took aim, and with the first turn set the transport on fire. Enveloped in flames, it plummeted to the ground 2 kilometres from our trenches, and it did not explode, because it landed on a ploughed field. The first to rush to the plane were soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, and when they ran up, they saw how several fascist officers and even 2 generals jumped out of the transport. They did not resist, immediately raised their hands. The prisoners were taken to the command post of the regiment, where they were interrogated by our commander, and then sent to the army headquarters. Hitler's lieutenant general, who turned out to be the commander of the aviation corps, at this interrogation told Colonel Prokofiev that he flew with a major general and 11 senior officers to the headquarters of the Nazi Army Group Center. But because of bad weather, their pilot went off course, and they skipped the front line. Having realized it, they dropped to the minimum height and started to return. That's when they were hit by our machine gunner. Yes, we got a solid tongue. By the way, he gave very valuable testimony at the army headquarters and then at the front. Soon, our battalion, for the second time, took its former area of defence on the front line. But I no longer had to command it, as I was soon appointed deputy commander of the regiment. But I did not forget about the battalion. Now and then I visited it. I was drawn there not only by the desire to be with people I liked, but also by the fact that the 1st Battalion was defending an area very convenient for sending our scouts to the rear of the fascists. Here, on the section of one of the companies between us and the enemy, there was a grove, half of which we once took away from him. It was close to the enemy defence, and our soldiers could, if necessary, covertly conduct scouts almost to the berms of the German trenches. True, it was also associated with a certain risk. After all, the Nazis realized that our scouts could use the grove. The reconnaissance in our regiment was now headed by Senior Lieutenant I, M. Kamenev, a Muscovite, a merrymaker and a joker, but at the same time a man of great willpower and exceptional courage. Before that, he commanded a machine gun company in my battalion. And how many times, sometimes, coming to me at the observation post, began to ask, "Let me go, Commander, to the fascists." Why? My hands itch, I want to fight. I'll make some noise there and then go back. And when I was appointed deputy commander of the regiment, and the post of assistant chief of staff for intelligence was vacated, Kamenev came to mind. Soon, on my recommendation, he was hired for this position. Kamenev immediately took up the platoon of reconnaissance. He picked up in it people experienced, desperate, began to prepare it for a sortie for language. But the first few such attempts were not successful. Kamenev did not despair. He assured, "There will be a language. Definitely will be." One day, the commander of the 10th Army Lieutenant General V.S. Popov and a member of the Military Council of the Army D.A. Karpenkov came to the regiment. They were accompanied by our commander. After hearing the reports of the regiment commander and chief of staff, the commander immediately turned to Kamenev. "When will be language, Senior Lieutenant? We need him very, very much, do you understand? Let it not be a general, as with that airplane, but still." "We'll get it tonight," Ivan Mironovich assured me. "We will." "Good," nodded the commander's head. "I'm waiting. Tomorrow morning call me, Yuri Mikhailovich." He turned to the division commander. When the commanders left, I called Senior Lieutenant Kamenev to me. I asked him if he was not in a hurry with his promise. "And where does he think to act? Is everything ready for it?" The senior lieutenant answered that yes, he had everything ready. He would act on the right flank, where the 1st Battalion was guarding. "It's a full moon, and there is not a cloud in the sky," I warned him. "Think about it. Maybe we should delay the search." "No," Ivan Mironovich answered firmly. "I gave my word to the commander. I decided to observe the actions of the reconnaissance myself, and, if necessary, to cover them with mortar fire. For what I took with me in the 1st Rifle Battalion commander of the mortar battalion of the regiment, the moon was shining brightly when we reached the battalion's combat outpost. "Delay at least 3 hours," I advised Kamenev. "The moon will go down in the second half of the night, and the German will be dozing in the trenches by morning." Kamenev agreed with my arguments, and we began to wait. At 4 o'clock, the senior lieutenant came to me and said, "It's time. An hour there, an hour back. An hour as a guest," he joked. "But we should be home by dawn. Wish me luck." I shook his hand. He waved to his scouts and was the first to climb the berm. An hour passed, another. Not a word from the group that left. The regime of the front line has not changed yet. Suddenly, somewhere on the right, it seems at the junction with the neighbour of the 1st Battalion, machine gun fire erupted and hand grenades burst. I immediately ordered the platoon commander of the guard platoon to take a squad of riflemen and quickly find out the situation. In the meantime, the battle began to subside. Less and less hand grenades were bursting. Machine gun and machine gun bursts were falling silent. And soon there was silence. Watchful, waiting. In a few minutes, the platoon commander of the combat guard came running back. Reported that our reconnaissance is already in the trench of the 1st Company. Senior Lieutenant Kamenev seriously wounded. 2 prisoners were taken. I rushed to the 1st Company. When I ran up to the scouts, I saw 2 of them leaning in the trench over the wounded man, bandaging his chest and stomach. "Alive?" I asked. "Alive, but unconscious. He was stabbed in the chest and stomach by a machine gun. Hurry to the dugout! Andreev!" I shouted to the company commander. "Follow me!" he commanded the scouts. They brought Kamenev into the dugout. In the dim light of a homemade lamp made from an artillery shell casing, the instructor rebandaged the senior lieutenant's chest and abdomen. Then he gave him a sniff of ammonia. Ivan Mironovich woke up, opened his eyes, moved them along the ceiling of the dugout. But now he looked at those standing and, seeing me, whispered quietly, "I have carried out the order. Pass on, Mikhail, the command," and fell silent at half a word. Forever. Then the scouts told me how it all happened. When the group crawled on the neutral strip, one of them noticed Hitlerites, who were heading to our defence. We began to watch and move behind them, slowly, as if his lips did not listen to him, said Staff Sergeant Sergeev. When Hitlerites made a passage in our minefield, just on the right flank of the 1st Company, and began to overcome it, Senior Lieutenant Kamenev gave a command to move behind them into the passage. Then we hit the fascists in the backs with automatic rifles. Those, of course, responded. A firefight ensued. We would have killed them quickly, but then from somewhere a second group of Germans came up to the passage. They must have followed the first one. So, now we were between 2 fires. The senior lieutenant jumped up, threw a grenade, but then he was hit too. In a word, we didn't save the commander. The senior sergeant was silent, turned away, slumped his shoulders. All those in the dugout sorrowfully faded away. It is hard, oh hard to lose such people as Senior Lieutenant Kamenev. At the end of November I was called to the phone by the Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel S.E. Klimakin, who replaced the recently recalled to the front headquarters Lieutenant Colonel P.G. Rack. He asked me if I had to fight near Moscow. I replied that I had fought and began to report where, in what division, and even in the regiment. But he interrupted. "All the data about you is there. The front headquarters is only specifying whether it's you." "And why these clarifications?" I asked Klimakin. "I do not know," he replied. "They check something, probably, and in January 1943 I was unexpectedly summoned to the division headquarters, and in a solemn atmosphere the commander read, 'The order of the Commander of the Western Front on my awarding the Order of Suvorov III degree.' The order stated that this award was given to me for skillful leadership of the battalion's combat operations in the defence of the capital of our homeland, Moscow. It was my first award, albeit belated but no less desirable. Meanwhile, on the southern wing of the huge Soviet-German front, our troops, having surrounded and destroyed at Stalingrad 300,000 grouping of Paulus, began to successfully develop the offensive to the west. The German fascist command of Army Group Center became worried. Were not the Russians preparing some trickery for them here, on the Spars-Demensk direction? Their reconnaissance intensified its actions. But searches and ambushes of enemy reconnaissance groups did not give the desired results. Our scouts every time thwarted their plans. Moreover, they themselves captured tongues. On the night of February 17th, I decided to go to the 2nd Battalion and check how the regiment commander's order to streamline the fire system was being carried out there. Halfway there, I heard the firing of 6-barrel German mortars, then bursts of shells and barrel artillery on the left flank of the 1st Battalion. I ran with the orderly along the message line to the first trench of the 3rd Company. There heard machine gun bursts, grenade explosions, guttural shouts in German. A few tens of metres from the trench we fall under the repeated but short enemy artillery attack. Having waited for it at the bottom of the message passage, we jump up again and run on. We turned into the mouth of the message passage, where I know the company commander's dugout is located. From the loosely covered door there is light. I looked through the observation window of the door and recoiled. There are fascists in the dugout. One stands in the middle, 2 others are sitting on the bunks and dressing their wounds. "A grenade!" I whispered to the orderly. When he pulled the pin and prepared the grenade for throwing, I open the door with a jerk and shout in full voice, "Throw it!" An explosion, the light goes out, moans come out of the dugout. "They won't get away. Follow me." We jumped out into the trench. We heard approaching stomping of feet on the left, excited conversation in German. "Along the trench, fire," I whispered to the orderly. He gives a long line, again moans, screams. Somewhere they're firing too. Grenades exploding over and over again. And suddenly there's silence. It dawned imperceptibly. And gradually the situation began to become clearer. At the first trench, to the right and left of me, lies several dozen corpses of Nazi soldiers. On the wire fence in various poses, also corpses. There are a lot of them. What was it? Battle reconnaissance or soldiers and sergeants from the 3rd Company start coming to me. "Where is your commander?" I ask. "Wounded, already evacuated to the rear." "Who of the commanders is still in the company?" "Me," I heard a voice. "This is Lieutenant G.M. Sinyuk." "Take the company," I told him. "Gather people, make calculations. Organize the fire system. Help the wounded. Any prisoners? Escort them after me." At the interrogation of a lightly wounded non-commissioned officer, said that they were from the reconnaissance battalion of the 92nd Infantry Division. Received orders to conduct a reconnaissance battle and at all costs to capture at least 1 Russian. The day before, their commanders spent the whole day on the front line, studying our defences, and at night, after a fire attack of their artillery, broke into the first trench of the 3rd Company. But our soldiers were not taken by surprise. And so, not many managed to get back, and the Tongue. He was not taken again. Yes, the enemy command apparently really seriously interested in our plans. They threw a whole reconnaissance battalion into the furnace. And what will happen next? Winter passed, then spring, summer came, and we're still on the defensive. During this time I managed to command the battalion again, this time Ski Battalion, and in May, after its disbandment, again received an appointment to the post of Deputy Commander of the Rifle Regiment, this time 885th. The regiment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel N.D. Kurashov, a Belarusian by nationality. Average height, stocky, very brave. Nikita Dmitrievich was an excellent organizer of the battle. He enjoyed well-deserved authority among the personnel. Major A.A. Nikitin came here as Chief of Staff. By the way, my classmate at the courses of improvement of command staff and a comrade in arms in the 878th Regiment. The Deputy Commander on political part was Major K.N. Orlov. During May, July 1943, the 885th Rifle Regiment was preparing to go on the offensive. The bosses therefore demanded from us the most complete information about the enemy, and we had almost none. What to do? All searches of both regimental and divisional reconnaissance were unsuccessful. There was a last chance to get this information by combat reconnaissance, but this type of combat has both positive and negative sides. The positive side is that the enemy, whether he wants it or not, still reveals himself. the system of fire, the degree of equipment in terms of engineering terrain, the true outline of the front line, the system of mine blast barriers. The negative side of this method of reconnaissance is that at the same time it reveals our own plans. After all, both we and Hitlerites immediately understood, if the opposing side conducts reconnaissance by combat, it means that we should wait for its offensive in this direction. But I repeat, we had no other way out. To conduct combat reconnaissance, we began to study two areas. By the way, it was planned to conduct it simultaneously in two areas, removed from each other along the front by 2.5 kilometers. With one group of scouts was always the regimental commander himself. With the other, I. Gradually the picture of our upcoming actions. We decided we would carry out reconnaissance by combat, not at night, but in the morning, after breakfast, when the bulk of enemy soldiers, having changed from night duty at the guns, would lie down to rest. To suppress Nazi machine guns, and even more so guns, to blind observation posts, we need a short but very powerful fire attack of our artillery and mortars. During this period, reconnaissance teams should move as close as possible to the front edge of the enemy's defences, so as not to waste time to cover the distance to the wire fences and the first trench of the enemy. During the week, we trained our scouts. For this purpose in the rear were equipped with two areas of terrain, almost exactly copied from the necessary areas of the Hitlerites' defences. On them, our soldiers practised their actions. July 17th came. At Ninjas, our artillery opened fire. The scouts of both groups, with the first bursts of shells rushed forward, began to overcome with the help of ladders and mats wire fence in front of the enemy defence. And then, when the artillery attack stopped, they broke into his first trench. The actions of the scouts were so rapid that the fascists were confused and could not offer them proper resistance. Soon the first group returned, bringing with them the tongue. Another reconnaissance group was also successful. It also captured a prisoner. Now began more substantive preparations for the offensive, and in a few days, having transferred its defence line to the 50th Army units, our division by July 9th concentrated in the forest northwest of the city of Kirov. From here it and other compounds of the 10th Army were to strike a blow aimed at bypassing the Spars-Demensky protrusion, to interact with the divisions of the 50th Army, to take in the ring located here, grouping of German troops. Our 290th Infantry Division was advancing on the right flank of the army with the task to break through the Hitlerites' defence on the front of 4.5 kilometres. The 885th Regiment was advancing in the first echelon on the right and was striking the main blow with its left flank. A few days before the beginning of the offensive division, Commander Y.M. Prokofiev, who had already become a Major General by that time, was appointed Commander of the Rifle Corps and left for a new place of service. Colonel I.G. Gasparian arrived instead. We got acquainted with the next commander during reconnaissance of the area. Isaac Gasparovich, as it turned out, had commanded an artillery fighter anti-tank brigade before, and at the first tasking it became clear to us that he deeply understands the nature of modern combat, its organisation when breaking through enemy defences, the use of artillery and other types of troops. On me personally, Isaac Gasparovich also made a very good impression. On August 9th, the army troops went on the offensive. On the first day was broken through the tactical depth of the enemy's defence. Especially strong battles were fought for the villages of Vorobyovi Gori, Dalnai, and near Natarovo. By the end of the fourth day of the offensive, the ring of encirclement around the enemy grouping in Spars-Demensk was closed. Our division after these battles was withdrawn to the Army Reserve. But here we did not stay long. Already on the 10th day of the offensive, the 290th Rifle Division was again involved in the breakthrough of the intermediate, by the way, prepared in advance, fascist defence line, which covered the approaches to Roslavel. Hitlerites defended this city with special persistence. In the settlements Tserkovska, Ilovets, Belarusa and Sergeyevka. They created strong strongholds, which literally had to be taken by storm. After the breakthrough of this line and mastering of these settlements, the division, developing the offensive bypassing Roslavel from the north, liberated dozens of other settlements, including the district centres Pochinok, Monastyrshchina and Gori. Then, for the second time, it was withdrawn to the army reserve and concentrated in the forests northwest of the district centre of Gori. By the way, this was already Belarus. In the evening, we all gathered at the regiment commander's house. Nikita Dmitrievich was in a visibly excited state, and soon it became clear why. "Comrades," he said, "we have entered the land of my native Belarus. As it has just been reported, the town of Krychev, where I was born and grew up, where my parents live, has been liberated. From here it is only an hour-and-a-half drive by car. And here, the commander of the division allowed me to visit my relatives for a few days. Komulo remains in charge of the regiment. So act Mikhail Grigorievich. Lieutenant Colonel N.D. Kureshov almost immediately left, and we received the order to organize the washing of personnel in the bath, to take the replenishment, to check weapons. By the end of the second day, the regiment was again to be in full combat readiness. On the third day in the regiments held a review of the regiments, and then the division, having made a 2-day march, concentrated 10 to 15 kilometres from the front line, east of the district centre Lenino. Preparation for the breakthrough of enemy defences in the Orsha direction began. Gathering regimental commanders, the commander informed that our right neighbour will be the 1st Polish division named after Tadeusz Kosciuszko, and ordered me to settle with its left-flanking regiment all the issues of interaction in battle. The district centre Lenino is located on the eastern bank of the river Mareya. Our front line passed along it. On its western bank, the Nazis. Their defence is powerful, prepared in advance. As we already knew, Hitlerites drove all the surrounding population to its construction under the fear of weapons. They erected as many as 3 lines, each of them up to 6 to 8 kilometres deep. The first boundary in turn had 3 defensive positions, with a widely developed system of trenches and communication passages, mine and wire, in several rows of stakeys, barriers. The enemy also shot in advance artillery, and the boundaries of the likely concentration and deployment of our troops in the event of an offensive. And starting from the distant approaches, and almost to the very front edge of their defence. In addition, in the sky continuously circled his scout planes, pointing bombing aircraft at the areas of concentration of our troops. Thus, in the first few days of air raids were seriously damaged the rear of our division. Fortunately, the regimental rear was not affected. The next morning we went with the Chief of Staff, Chief of Artillery and some other officers to the area specified by the division commander. We entered a populated area. The house where the headquarters of the Polish regiment was located was not so difficult to find. There were clerks, communicators, messengers hustling about. We entered the house. At the table sat a middle-aged commander and gave others some orders. When we entered, he was silent. He looked at us questioningly. I identified myself, asked where I could see the regiment commander. "I am the regiment commander," in pure Russian introduced himself, sitting at the table, and stood up. "Lieutenant Colonel Chavinsky." We shook hands. The Polish Kompolka, leaving only his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel V.S. Kondratovich, asked the others to leave. We got to talking. It was important for me to know when the Poles were thinking of working on the ground. It would be there to clarify all the issues of interaction. Chavinsky replied that only an hour ago he received a combat task for the regiment, and now he was just bringing it to his officers. "And tomorrow morning we will work on the ground," he added. "Time is short, so—" While we were talking, our chiefs of staff had already started their work. They mapped the tasks of each regiment, the boundary lines between them, the initial boundaries for the offensive. Major Nikitin shared with his Polish colleague all the data on the enemy that we had to date. That was the end of our first visit to our Polish friends. And the next morning we met again on the front line and decided all the issues of interaction between our two regiments. Having come from reconnaissance, I learned that Lieutenant Colonel N.D. Kurashov had arrived from a short leave. I reported to him about the work we have done, that all issues of interaction with our neighbour, the commander of the 2nd Regiment of the Polish Division, have been resolved. The offensive is scheduled for tomorrow. The time of its beginning is still unknown, will be reported additionally. With the onset of dusk, battalions of the regiment began to take the initial position for the offensive. Artillery and mortar units moved to firing positions in advance, even last night, and even during the day were able to hold the shooting of many targets in the enemy's defence. So everything is ready. But what does the coming day have in store for us? We're worried. Mentar artillery opens fire on the enemy defences. Artillery preparation lasts for an hour, and quite powerful. The density of artillery, as we later learned, reached more than 100 barrels per kilometre of front. But when our artillery preparation was coming to an end, a whole armada of airplanes appeared on the horizon, as it seemed at first, from the Hitlerites' side. It was getting closer and closer, and here we already distinguish the battle formation of Lynx and squadrons of German bombers. We could not hear the hum of their engines because of the artillery fire and shell bursts. But when the airplanes hovered over the fighting order of our troops and began to rain bombing, the ground already shook, moved under our feet. True, for fear of hitting their troops, enemy pilots dropped deadly cargo on the second echelons, on reserves and observation posts, on the firing positions of artillery. And at this time, the first chain of attackers, and our fighters and Poles, is already overcoming, fording the Morea, passages in minefields, in wire barriers. I am at the command post of the 1st Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Kurashov decided so. I, to the 1st, Deputy Major Petrov, to the 2nd Battalion. Our units attacked amicably. Here they burst into the first enemy trench with shouts of hurrah, and, without lingering in it, rushed to the second one, which was also captured from the start. It seemed that nothing could stop the Soviet and Polish fighters. But suddenly, from the third trench, Hitlerites led such a dense machine gun and machine gun fire that the chain lay down. I see the commanders trying to raise their men, but the strong enemy fire time after time pressed them to the ground. It turned out that the Germans used a kind of trickery here. For several days in a row, waiting for our offensive, they, leaving in the 1st and 2nd trenches only cover, before dawn withdrew the main forces of their infantry in the 3rd, and here they waited until 12 o'clock in the afternoon. If the Russians did not attack that day, said later a captured Hitler officer, after 12 o'clock we moved out again along the lines of communication to the front line, and we attacked at 9 o'clock. We need to urgently call for artillery fire. I ordered the commander of the 1st Battalion to give a series of red rockets in the direction of the enemy, target designation for our artillery. The same signal was given by the 2nd Battalion. Artillerymen opened fire immediately. Hundreds of shells fell on the 3rd enemy trench. Now we have to lift the men while the enemy is pinned to the ground. Attack forward! Battalions rose amicably and with shouts of hurrah rushed forward. The first to break into the 3rd trench were the soldiers of the 1st Company. After them, 2nd, 3rd, Hitlerites are running, in the 1st Battalion success. And what about the 2nd? Through binoculars I see an attacking chain, in front of which an officer is running with a pistol in his hand. Who would that be? It's Major Petrov, the regiment's deputy commander. He's the only one who we have in blue pants. The fascists are firing heavily on the battalion. Here and there soldiers are falling to the ground. But here the first groups of them burst into the trench, grenade explosions and machine gun fire. Forward, forward, do not linger in the trench, I whisper, as if the attackers can hear me. At this time, about a company of fighters jump out of the trench. In front again, officer in blue pants. Behind the first group, other units splash across the trench. We have order, and how is the neighbour on the right? I point my binoculars there. A chain of soldiers in green overcoats, almost a solid wall moving forward, at the level of the 1st Battalion. Companies in the Polish army are big. If we have a staff of 75 people in them, the Poles have 100. Besides, I look at the neighbour's chain from the side. That's why it seems that he is attacking too dense combat order. We are moving with the commander behind the battalion. We meet a column of prisoners. It is led by 2 of our young fighters. As they approached us, they smiled. "How many?" I ask one of them and nod at the prisoners. 36, laughs the fighter. In front of the battalion is a settlement. On the right is a height. From behind the village, the enemy soon opened heavy artillery fire on the battalion and on the neighbour on the right. The attackers lay down. Through binoculars, I see how from behind the height appeared first 2, then 3, more enemy tanks. Behind them, the whole infantry battalion of fascists is deployed in combat order. The spearhead of the counterattack is directed at the junction with a neighbour. From the observation post of the regiment commander also noticed the counterattackers. Our artillery opened barrage fire, cutting off the infantry. With the tanks fought anti-tank guns attached to the 1st Battalion. 2 of them almost immediately caught fire. The rest slowed down, not daring to go forward without infantry, and the machine guns were already firing at them, pinning them to the ground. 10 minutes passed, and now the tanks are starting to pull back, behind the niches and the infantry. The counter-attack of the enemy has smothered. I was called on the radio by the Chief of Staff of the division, Colonel S.E. Klimakin. Transmitted the order of the commander. Immediately take command of the 882nd Rifle Regiment. This regiment was in the 2nd echelon of the division. What could happen there? I reported to the Chief of Staff that our regiment reflects a counterattack, and my presence here is simply necessary. Colonel Klimakin ordered me not to move away from the radio. Now he will report all this to the division commander and pass his decision to me. A few minutes passed. The Chief of Staff of the division did not come to the radio station, and I, not leaving the radio, watched through binoculars as the enemy infantry battalion was preparing for a second counterattack. Along his chain ran over 2 officers, giving soldiers some commands. Finally, the radio station of the Chief of Staff of the division again worked, and I heard in the headphones voice Klimakin. 10th ordered urgently to take command of the 882nd Regiment. Counterattack let them reflect without you. It took me almost an hour and a half to get to the command post of the 882nd Regiment. Continuous Nazi air raids interfered, but I made it. At the command post itself there is a lot of destruction. There are 2 broken radios and several shattered telephone sets. Here and there gaping huge craters from bombs, trenches, and passages of communication, in many places blocked, and not a single person is to be seen anywhere. I don't understand anything. How to contact the division commander? Where are the battalions of the regiment? In what condition are they? And where are the men? It can't be that everyone who was here died. While I was going around and inspecting the destruction, a lieutenant with 2 soldiers came up to me. One of them had a radio on his shoulder. The lieutenant, recognizing who I was, reported, "I was sent to your disposal by the Chief of Staff of the division." That's better. I order to deploy the radio station and connect me with the division commander. Stefanenko and his Chief of Staff are severely concussed, Colonel Gasparian told me. So deal with the regiment, and the task will familiarize you with the head of the operational department. He will be with you soon. Tentatively tomorrow morning be ready to put the regiment into battle. Thanking the division commander for his trust in me, I asked to send another radio station to communicate with battalion commanders. Soon the deputy commander of the 882nd Regiment, Major M. E. Vlasov, arrived at the CP. He was in one of the battalions, and when there was a loss of communication with both the regiment commander and the chief of staff, worried, Vlasov decided to come here, at the command post, to clarify the situation, and so, Major Vlasov I knew a long time ago. While still being battalion commanders, only, however, in different regiments, we repeatedly met with him. Mikhail Yegorovich had a good memory, could quickly assess the situation and make the right decision. And ideally, it was he, the deputy commander of the regiment, should have replaced Stefanenko. But the choice of the commander for some reason fell on me, a man from another regiment. Strange. Could not hide his surprise on Vlasov when he asked, "What wind brought you to us, Mikhail Grigorievich?" "I was appointed commander of your regiment." Vlasov raised his eyebrows, then smiled embarrassedly, but immediately mastered himself and said, "Well, the commander knows better. Let's sort it out. I don't know what actually happened here either." I pointed to the destroyed dugouts, craters, broken radios and telephone sets. "So that's why the connection was interrupted." Vlasov stretched out. "What about them? Not a soul, and no one to ask." "That's what, Mikhail Igorovich." I turned to him. "We need to urgently create a headquarters. Where is the Assistant Chief of Staff? Who can take charge of communications?" "The Assistant Chief of Staff must be somewhere in the rear." "Is he a smart guy?" "As if nothing." "Send your orderly to get him. Get the commander of the communications company over here too." I shouted to him through the growing hum of airplanes. 12 German bombers passed over us. A few minutes later, somewhere in the rear, there were deafening explosions of bombs. While Vlasov was giving orders to his orderly, a captain came to me, and with him a petty officer and 3 soldiers with a radio station. The captain turned out to be the chief of reconnaissance of this regiment, and the petty officer and the men were radio operators. He met them when he was returning from the medical centre, where he accompanied the contused commander, chief of staff, and deputy regimental commander. The petty officer asked the captain to show him the control point of the 800 second rifle, explaining that he had been sent by the chief of communications of the division to the disposal of Major Komulo. 2 radio stations or something, but it's still impossible to get in touch with the battalions. No one knows what kind of working waves they have. "Does your orderly know where the battalions are?" I asked Vlasov. And having heard an affirmative answer, I ordered to send him to one of the battalions to find out from the signallers their call signs and working waves. So what happened here at the CP 808 2nd Regiment? This was told to me and Major M.E. Vlasov, Captain, Chief of Intelligence. "When the artillery training began," he reported, "we all, including the regiment commander, went out of the dugout upstairs to observe its results. And then also the attack of the regiments of the first echelon. Especially naturally it was interesting to watch the actions of the Poles. But as soon as we were out, someone shouted, 'Air!' Too late, because we jumped into the trench under the bomb bursts. So it exploded nearby. The commander, commander-in-chief and deputy commander were covered with earth and concussed. They barely got him out of there. 'There's communication with battalions,' shouted at that time a petty officer without taking off his earphones. 'Hearing is good. Everyone is answering.' 'Good. Tell them to be on the receiving end.' Major P.K. Kuzmin, head of the division's operational department, came up to us. He was accompanied by 2 machine gunners. After saying hello, Pavel Kuzmich asked if I had a map. I answered in the affirmative. 'Good,' said Kuzmin. 'Still, I'll give you mine. Everything is already mapped on it. Here, look.' Unfolding the map, he pencil showed a strip of division, the nearest task, further and the task of the day. Then, the tasks of the regiments of the first echelon, the boundary of the second echelon, to enter the battle and the time of entry. Clarifying how will be provided for the entry into battle 882nd Regiment, asked Kuzmin, 'Will the units of the first echelon to this depth by morning?' I do not know, shrugged his shoulders. We have to literally chew through the enemy's defence. His aviation is very rampant. Well, as for your regiment, apparently it will have to be brought in from this line, and he drew a red pencil line a kilometre west of the settlement, from which the 885th Rifle Regiment was counter-attacked by the Nazis. Having read the question in my eyes, he said, Kurashev's counter-attack was repulsed. Calm down. Tregubovo was taken. Now there is a battle for the village Vasyuki. Soon Major Vlasov's orderly returned. Together with him came the Assistant Chief of Staff and the Commander of the Communication Company. Well, there is a Scout, Chief of Staff, Chief of Communications, so there is a headquarters. We can already fight. Again contacted with the combatants. They reported that their losses are small. They know their tasks. I ordered to urgently send to me the adjutants of battalions to draw on their maps a new boundary of the regiment's entry into the battle. The fall day is short. It passes especially quickly in such a super-complicated situation. While we were settling all the issues, the sun began to slip towards the horizon. Wire communication is established, reported in the meantime, the commander of the communications company. You can talk to the division headquarters. Good. Connect me with the commander. When I picked up the phone, I heard the familiar voice of Colonel Gasparian with a Caucasian accent. Listen, Komolo, Kurashov is wounded. They're taking him out of the battlefield now. Leave Vlasov on the spot and go to your regiment. The village of Vasyuki has been taken, but it must be held at all costs. Go on, dear. Take command of the 885th Regiment. Don't take offence that I'm chasing you from place to place. Put Vlasov on the phone. I handed the phone to Mikhail Yegorovitch. Returning to my regiment, I went to its old command post. I found the Chief of Staff there. Major Nikitin, reporting the situation, asked, Do you know that Kurashov is wounded? Now they are bringing him here. You see, the regiment could not take these damn Vasyuki. They changed hands twice. Then Kurashov went there himself. They took the village, but Nikita Dmitrievich didn't escape. Is there a connection with the battalions? I asked the Chief of Staff. There is, but only by radio. And wire. No matter how many times we lay a string, Hitlerites break it with artillery or aviation. Are the commanders all right? 2 of them are gone. There's only one left in the 3rd Battalion. He's now north of Vasyuki, repulsing fascist counterattacks. And how are the neighbours doing? The same counterattacks, one after another. I'm going to Vasyuki. Give me a guide. And at night you too move closer. It's too far to control the regiment from here. I just wanted to leave the dugout when I heard someone shouting, The wounded regiment commander is being carried. When the stretcher was placed near the command post, Nikita Dmitrievich was no longer moaning. Only looked with his blue eyes at all those who stood above him. He was conscious, but could not speak. The bullet had pierced his jaw, passed under his tongue, and came out just above his ear. When he turned his eyes to me, he perked up. He tried to point to his cheek with his hand. I nodded in a sign that I could see his distress, and in turn, pointing with a finger in his chest, he pointed in the direction of the enemy. I'm going there instead of you. Nikita Dmitrievich covered his eyes, letting me know that he understood me and was very pleased with it. Lieutenant Colonel Kurashov was evacuated to the rear, and I took a guide and went to the front. It got dark. A fine rain was drizzling. On the left, near Lenino, our tanks were humming. The wounded were coming towards us, and to the front line petty officers and cooks were carrying thermoses and ammunition, asking the wounded where to find the companies they needed. The fighting had quieted down. Only rockets rose into the sky now and then, illuminating the low-hanging clouds. Thoughts were swarming in my head, outrunning one another. Would we hold Vasyuki? How many men were left in the regiment? Who is now in command of the 1st and 2nd Battalions? Will ammunition be delivered by morning? Tomorrow we have to continue the offensive. Behind these thoughts, I did not notice how I reached the observation post, from where Kurashov controlled the regiment's battle. The CP was equipped in the German trench, which was at a height of 200 metres in front of the village of Vasiuki. Visibility from here was excellent. At the observation point, in addition to the commander of the artillery regiment, Lieutenant Colonel B.I. Tokar were Assistant Chief of Staff, Captain G.I. Bezugli, Chief of Intelligence, Captain N.M. Guriev, Chief of Artillery, Captain S.I. Orlov, Chief of Engineering Service, Captain P.A. Alexeyev, and Chief of Communications Regiment, Captain I. D. Parshikov. D. Parshikov heard their reports on the state of affairs. The first, of course, the first Assistant Chief of Staff, Captain Bezugli. Regiment, according to his report, broke through 2 defensive positions of the enemy and advanced to a depth of 4 kilometres. Possessed the village of Tregubovo. Now the 1st and 2nd Battalions broke into Vasiuki and firmly hold them. The 3rd Battalion captured an unnamed height to the right of the village. In the regiment's reserve is a company of machine gunners, located here on the height. Losses are being clarified. The commander of the 1st Battalion, Captain G.V. Shliakovsky, wounded. Instead of him, the battalion is commanded by the commander of the 1st Company. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, Captain V.G. Tabakov, is also wounded. No one in his place has not yet been appointed. Combat 3, Captain A.I. Sansevich in place. Alas, as it turned out a little later, was killed, and Captain Sansevich. Instead of him in command of the battalion came Senior Lieutenant G.T. Bakhmisov. The 2nd reported the Chief of Intelligence. In front of the regiment, reported Captain Guriev, defended the 3rd Battalion of the 163rd Infantry Regiment of the 95th Infantry Division. This is a fresh division, approached from the reserve. The prisoners show that they were ordered to hold the occupied line to the last. In the 2nd echelon against us, defended by the 165th Infantry Regiment. 2 battalions of it held the 3rd position, and 1 battalion, supported by tanks, counter-attacked us and the neighbour on the right. The prisoners from this regiment say that in the 163rd Regiment, a lot of cowards and traitors. It was they who gave, they say, an opportunity for the Russians to break through their defences. In the morning, continued Guriev, we must expect new counterattacks. The fascists will try to knock us out of here. They have the opportunity to manoeuvre forces. They can, for example, remove troops from unattacked areas. After all, we make a breakthrough on a narrow front. Chief of Artillery reported losses in the regimental battery, where 2 guns out of action. One of them can be repaired by morning. In the mortar battery, 1 mortar is broken and cannot be repaired. I ordered the Chief of Artillery by morning to be sure to restore the gun in the regimental battery and overnight to deliver more ammunition. Soon the data from the battalions began to arrive. In the companies on average, 40-45 soldiers and sergeants were left. Not much. Call the Chief of Staff to the radio, I ordered. Nachishtaba on the radio. Alexander Artemovich, I said to the Chief of Staff, take measures to deliver ammunition for all types of weapons. Tell the Chief of Artillery that he is responsible for their delivery to all battalions and batteries. Major A.A. Nikitin listened attentively to me, asked me something, and at the end said that from the division headquarters received a combat order tomorrow morning to continue the offensive. Now put the situation on the map, he said. Here I have better conditions than you. I will work out the combat order and arrive to you as early as possible. Chief of Staff came to the observation post of the regiment at midnight. In the dim light of a smokestack, we leaned with him over the unfolded map. Tomorrow morning, the division commander enters the battle of the 2nd Echelon, 892nd Rifle, at the junction of the regiments of the 1st Echelon, bypassing the village of Vasiuki on the left. And the Chief of Staff showed on the map the boundary of the regiment's entry into the battle and the direction of its offensive. We are ordered, he continued, the village of Vasiuki to hold 1 battalion, the other 2 in cooperation with the neighbour on the right, the 2nd Regiment of the Polish Division to continue to develop the offensive to bypass Wasiuki on the right, to complete the breakthrough of the 3rd defensive position of the enemy, to seize the unnamed heights and hold them firmly. The commander of the 1st Polish Division also enters the battle, his 2nd echelon in the centre of the combat order. The depth of the task of the regiment about 6 kilometres. "And what do you hear about the 5th May Corps?" I asked Nikitin. "Will be introduced on the morning of the 3rd day of the operation, when we break through the 3rd defensive position of the enemy. October 13th, after a short fire raid, introducing the 2nd echelons into the battle, both divisions, Polish and ours, resumed the offensive. Hitlerites, as expected, overnight regrouped their forces, pulled up fresh, removing them from unattacked areas of their defences and from the depths. They also concentrated their artillery, and from the very first minutes of the battle began to offer fierce resistance. Above the fighting order of divisions and mechanised corps, parts of which on the night of October 13th were pulled up in the area of Lenino, hovered enemy aircraft, making continuous bombing strikes on them. A particularly hot battle broke out over the unnamed heights. Battalions of the 885th Infantry and the 2nd Regiment of the Polish Division managed to seize them only by evening. The night of October 14th passed in great tension for both troops and headquarters. Still, by 6 o'clock in the morning, I managed to report to the commander about the readiness of the regiment to the offensive. "The 5th Mech Corps is entering the battle," said Isaac Gasparovich. "Do not lag behind him. By the way, do you have no one from the tankers?" "No." "They must have gotten lost. Well, look, wait for the attack signal." The commander hung up the phone. A few minutes after this conversation, I got a report that some general was coming along the trench towards me. I came out of the dugout. It was still languid outside. There were indeed several men walking along the trench. The first one was grumbling unhappily. "But where is he?" "At the Devil's." "Kulichki?" I heard his last words. "Here, Comrade General," said someone behind the general's back. "There's the dugout." When the group approached, I asked who they were. The same hoarse bass answered my question. "And who are you?" "Regimental commander." "So you are the regiment commander?" the general asked me. "What a climb!" "Please come into the dugout, Comrade General." I invited him. 3 men came into the dugout after me. A major general of tank troops, a small colonel and a captain. I am the deputy commander of the 5th Mechanized Corps. "Something you are ahead, Comrade General, and no tanks are visible," I joked. Brother, tanks have to be led by someone too. Here I am going forward, and they are behind me." The general also got off with a joke. "Now let's get down to business. You've taken the unnamed heights behind this village. What's its name?" "Wasiuki, Comrade General," taking out a map, the colonel prompted. Yes, Wasiuki." "The village of Wasiuki is ours, and the unnamed heights to the west of it are also ours," I answered. "So then, behind Wasiuki, in front of these nameless heights, my tankers should enter the battle, and you, Kompolka, must support them. Do you have anything?" Chief of Staff opened his map and laid out in front of the general. I reported that the regiment has the task together with parts of their corps to complete the breakthrough of the Nazi defences. I showed the direction of the offensive and the tasks of the regiment on the map. "Provide your entry," I continued, 3 artillery divisions and a mortar battery. Our infantry, before the approach of tanks to it, fire from the spot strikes the enemy, and with the approach of tanks rises and following them attack further. The general approved the proposed variant of the regiment's actions. While we were talking, it dawned outside. We went out with the general into the trench. I showed him the village of Wasiuki and unnamed heights, on one of which was NP Regiment. On the terrain, I also indicated the boundary lines, the direction of the regiment's offensive, and the boundary of the Mechanized Corps unit's entry into the battle. The frame circled above us, but it turned away and began to look for something above Lenino, east of it. The general nodded his head in its direction. Rama circled for another 15 minutes and departed. There were a few minutes left before the artillery preparation began. The colonel reported to the general that the tanks had passed the starting line and were moving to the front line. "Air!" A loud command was heard. German aviation appeared on the horizon. "They are coming," the general muttered. "Today is a sunny day. The weather is favourable for them." Bombers went at a low altitude in an even formation, and around them, then soaring up, then diving, ran skittish messers. "These will not bomb here," said the general when the bombers passed over us. "They will now dump their cargo on mine. Here will come others." From the lead bombers that flew over Lenino broke off a lot of oblong bombs, from afar resembling black water droplets. "They are dropping small things on the tanks," said the general. "It's hard to dodge such a dense amount." The second echelon of airplanes began to bomb directly the settlement of Lenino. The next wave of enemy bombers appeared when our artillery preparation began. Part of them again came in on the tank columns, which were already approaching the front edge of the fascist defence, and began to turn in combat order. The rest dropped their load on the artillery firing positions. There was a pause in the artillery preparation. The density of fire on the Hitlerite defences decreased. We had to do something to compensate for this loss. Told this to the commander of the artillery regiment, Lieutenant Kolai Tokar. "What can be done?" he asked me. Divisional commanders reported that there were heavy losses on the firing lines. "One way out," I shouted in his ear, as the Junkers were coming in for another dive and drowned out our conversation. "Extend the fire training to 20 minutes. See, the tanks are held up by aviation." "And the shells?" Tokar asked. "Those that remained in the incapacitated calculations." Lieutenant Colonel Tokar shrugged, then began to call the artillery commander of the division. And I went to the general and asked him to speed up the deployment of tanks, as the artillery preparation is already coming to an end. "I know," said the general, "but aviation delays." At that moment, Tokar appeared from behind and said that the superiors approved the decision to extend the fire preparation to 20 minutes. Meanwhile, the tanks had turned around and were now coming at the enemy in an even battle line. Combati reported that they are ready to attack. "Wait for the tanks. As they come to you, go up behind them in the attack." The Chief of Staff confirmed their decision. Lieutenant Colonel Tokar came up and pointed to his watch. 2 minutes left until the end of the artillery preparation," he shouted loudly so that the general could hear. The tanks were slowly moving forward and had not yet approached the village. "What to do?" Tokar asked. 20 minutes have elapsed. "Go on!" I shouted to him, and with no less density. Tanks approached the enemy defence at such a distance, when his anti-tank means could already hit them, and I was afraid that if our artillery at this point stopped fire preparation, or even reduced the density of fire, the attack could fail. On the 24th minute of artillery preparation, tanks finally approached our infantry. I see how the battalions rose up in friendship and with shouts of hurrah ran after the tanks. And their crews, seeing that now they were no longer alone, that the infantry was following them, accelerated their movement. Our artillery moved the fire into the depths, and as soon as its bursts moved behind the front edge of the enemy's defence, his anti-tank means came to life. Several of our tanks caught fire at once. "We should destroy the enemy guns to help the tankers," I said Lieutenant Colonel Tokar. "Mikhail, we are short of shells," he pleaded. "You know the day is just beginning, and the tankers have their own guns. Let them suppress anti-tank means themselves. And you still give fire," I said, "and then we'll see. Now the main thing, not to let the attack to choke." The general also asked to suppress several anti-tank guns of the enemy, which were firing most intensely on his tanks. What was Tokar to do? The only thing was to take a tube in his hand. After a while, our artillerymen covered the fascist guns with their fire, and the tanks accelerated their movement. And still on the battlefield, there were already many of our shot-down vehicles. Some of them were on fire, others stood leaning sideways. Others were spinning on the spot with broken tracks. Yes, we won't get far that way, the general said, putting down his binoculars. What a thing to do, such a strong defence, and yet we must break through it. The Nazi defence turned out to be really very strong. During the night, the Nazis, as it turned out later, managed to pull up and put another fresh infantry division in the defence. The advance of the regiment soon began to slow down. By 12 o'clock in the afternoon, attacks were already conducted only on individual enemy strongholds and his firing points. As a result, for 4 hours of offensive, the regiment, together with the tankers, advanced only 2.5 kilometres. And in other units, advancing on the left of our regiment, and even without tanks, the success was even less. "Comrade General, is there a second echelon in the corps?" I asked the deputy commander. "Mechanized brigade," he replied. "Could it not be introduced into the battle in the offensive zone of the Polish division? Its units have moved forward much further than we." The general raised binoculars to his eyes and took a long look at the battle orders of the advancing regiments. "Call me the first," he finally ordered, turning to the commander-communicator who arrived with him. Having received a good from the commander, the general appealed to us with a request to support by artillery fire the advance and entry of the second echelon of the corps in the neighbours' strip on the right. His request I reported to the division commander, and in the afternoon the mechanized brigade was introduced into the battle in the offensive strip of the 2nd Regiment of the 1st Polish Division. By evening, the enemy defence was broken through by us to the full tactical depth. Parts of the 1st Polish Division, named after Tadeusz Kosciuszko, and our 290th Infantry Division, in cooperation with parts of the 5th Mechanized Corps, broke through the first defensive line of the enemy defence in the Orsha direction, inflicting the enemy very significant losses. We advanced to a depth of 10 to 12 kilometres, having fulfilled the task set before us. I would like to say a kind word about Polish soldiers. In the battles near Lenino, 243 of them were awarded for courage and heroism with Soviet orders and medals, and 3 were awarded the high title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Yes, it was here, on the Belarusian land, in October 1943, that the soldiers of the revived Polish army received their first baptism of fire. In the fierce battles against the fascist invaders, the combat friendship between the armies of our two brotherly peoples was forged. By evening, from the division headquarters came the order to consolidate on the achieved line. But we did not have to organize the defense. Almost immediately called the head of the operational department of the division, Major P.K. Kuzmin, and told me, "Get ready for the shift. Regimental area to surrender tonight, and by dawn to concentrate." And he dictated the map coordinates of the new area of concentration. In conclusion, he said that Colonel Gasparian had just been taken to the hospital with an acute attack of angina pectoris, and Colonel S.E. Klimakin was left in charge of the commander. In the new area of concentration we stood for 2 days, tidied up the regiment, washed, cut the personnel, sanitized, repaired weapons, and on the night of October 18th we went on a march, and again to the north, along the front line. By the morning of October 20th, we concentrated in the forests to the east of the district centre Liadi, in the Orsha region. On the second day we began to receive replenishment. 2 combatants, 2 captains, I.P. Rasmotrev and K.K. Sergabayev arrived. Until October 30th, we were fully staffed. The division at this time became part of the 69th Rifle Corps, which was commanded by Major General T.P. Krugliakov. On November 1st, he arranged a review of my regiment, and on November 7th, a new general formation of the regiment, this time to celebrate the 26th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The rally was opened by my new deputy in the political part, Major V.A. Evdokimov, who arrived in the regiment instead of Major P.F. Petrov, mortally wounded in the battles near Lenino and died in the infirmary. I spoke after him. I congratulated the personnel with a wonderful holiday, noted that the Red Army has already begun to expel the Nazi invaders from our land. I also told about our tasks, called on all soldiers and commanders to master the entrusted weapons in the shortest possible time to beat the fascists even harder. I finished my short speech with greetings in honour of the party, the Soviet people and the army. After me spoke Battalion Commander Captain K.K. Siergabayev, Commander of the 8th Company Lieutenant Y.F. Zarudin, several other fighters and commanders. Then a festive dinner was arranged. After it, an amateur art concert given by the forces of the regiment and the Airfield Maintenance Battalion, which was located next to our 3rd Battalion. Colonel Klimakin was still in command of the division. Gasparian was still not discharged from the hospital. We were all looking forward to his return, but the head of the division medical service, Major B.Y. Pechersky, once said that the commander would not be back in action soon. Meanwhile, it was deep Belarusian autumn with constant rain and fog. At night it was freezing. On November 8th, I received a command from the division headquarters. Tomorrow, November 9th, to leave for reconnaissance. Having taken the necessary staff and all the combatants, I left at dawn with them along the specified route. In the district centre, Liadi, our group suddenly came under heavy artillery fire of German long-range artillery. 2 of my companions were wounded, and a horse was killed under one. After the artillery attack, on the western outskirts of the district centre, we saw an old man standing by a cellar. Calling him over, I asked him if the Nazis often shelled like that. The old man said that 3 times a day, in the morning, at lunchtime and late in the evening, always at the same time. Why? Because Liadi is at the crossroads of north-south and east-west roads, and they intersect in the village itself. And the terrain here is swampy, there are no bypass routes, so, I calculate, to prevent the regiment from being hit by German artillery fire and not to suffer premature losses, it is necessary to lead it through Liadi, when there is no shelling. We probably won't march in the daytime, but everything can be. After all, we, for example, moved to Lenino in the daytime. I set a task to the Chief of Staff to study the time of German artillery fire raids on Liadi, to take it into account when planning the march. We bandaged the wounded and left them in the cellar of the old man in order to pick them up on the way back. We drove on. It was difficult even for horses to walk on the muddy country roads. Their feet were slipping, moving apart, and they stumbled every now and then. "If it does not freeze," said approaching me Deputy Major Yevdokimov, "people will be hard, especially the replenishments from the south. They are used to walking on dry sands, and here there is such mud." "What can you do?" I said. "They will go if they have to, but the march should be well thought out and planned. It's not far to the initial area, only 26 kilometres. The initial area was 7 kilometres from the front edge of the enemy's defence. It was an old pine forest with smooth clearings and hard ground. Well, that's not bad. By 14 Oas, reconnaissance was completed, and we arrived at the specified time at the meeting place with Collier Klimakin. Other regimental commanders began to arrive. I see Lieutenant Colonel F.M. Stefanenko, who returned from the hospital to his 882nd Rifle after a contusion. Instead of Lieutenant Colonel F.R. Simukova, who was wounded from near Lenino, 878th Regiment took Major V.T. Anashkin. All in high spirits, joking, asking each other about business. With Colonel Klimakin arrived and the Corps Commander Major General Krupniakov. Both came in Willis, accompanied by their Chiefs of Staff. "How are you?" addressed the Comcorps to all those standing. We remained silent, as his question seemed to concern everyone, but at the same time no one in particular. "Why are you silent?" "Well, at least you, Homulo, corrected the case. I remember the inspection of your regiment. There were a lot of faults in it. It was hard to object to the Corps commander. Yes, until October 30th, the regiment was not yet complete. The replenishment had just arrived. But since then, 10 whole days have passed. Much has been done. The regiment has become unrecognizable." "I have corrected things, Comrade General," I answered. "I ask you to look at the regiment again." "Very well. If I have time, I will come. If not, I will see it in battle. Nodded his head. Then briefly told us about the upcoming cases. Warned, prepare, comrades, regiments properly. The task will not be easy. The enemy in front of us burrowed into the ground thoroughly, encircled with pillboxes and bunkers, so that we will have to literally smoke him out of the forced places. We returned to the location late at night, and on the morning of November 10th, we received an order, on the night of November 11th, to concentrate in the initial area. The regiment marched in an organised manner and without losses. On the morning of November 11th, a representative of the Corps headquarters arrived and handed me a package, with the order to the Corps to attack and a map with the situation. Not even having read the content of the order, but having seen only the title and the Comcorps signature, I told the representative that he handed the package to the wrong place. He probably needs the division headquarters, and here, the headquarters of the regiment. "Are you the commander of the 885th Regiment?" the captain asked in turn. "Yes," I answered. "Then everything is correct. The Chief of Staff of the Corps ordered to hand the package to you personally." I began to read the order. From it, I understood that our 290th Infantry Division is the second echelon of the Corps, and my 885th Rifle Regiment is the Corps Reserve. It indicated the direction of our movement and the lines to be secured. "That's why the package is addressed to you," said the representative of the Corps headquarters, when I understood the task. "Readiness for the offensive corps, stated in the order, 24.0, 13 turn says, 1943. General T.P. Krugliakov called. Asked me if I received the order and whether there are any questions. I reported to the commander that the order was received. The task is clear. The organisation of communication and other issues my Chief of Staff clarifies in the Corps headquarters. Today at noon, I will organise reconnaissance of the routes of the regiment. In the evening received an order from the division headquarters. It said, November 12th, the Corps commander in the morning reconnaissance on the front line with the commanders of divisions of the first echelon, and from 14 Orsen organises a training session on interaction on the sandbox. Regimental Commander, Deputy for Political Affairs, and Chief of Staff to be at the appointed time to be at this training. Further, the place of its holding was indicated. At the edge of the forest, where we were ordered to arrive, there were already division commanders of the first echelon with their regimental commanders, the staff of the Corps and the 33rd Army. On the slope of the hillside immediately noticed a half-metre deepened square. It reproduced the terrain of the upcoming combat operations of the Corps. Plotted and tactical situation, the delimitation lines between divisions and regiments, the conditional name of units in the initial position, all this is in red colour. On the opposite side of the square, but already in blue colour, are marked several rows of trenches, many communication lines, areas where enemy reserves are located. In the middle of this peculiar layout stands the head of the operational department of the Corps headquarters, Colonel E. I. Rosliakov. With a long pointer he shows his assistants, major and captain, in what place to put this or that conventional sign. Division commanders and chiefs of staff, having unfolded the maps, checked the tasks drawn on them, with this model, and wondered aloud who came up with such a thing. Colonel Rosliakov answered them. Our Comcorps was once a teacher at the academy. It was his idea. When the hands showed 1400, General Krugliakov came to us. He walked around the model from all sides, asked something softly to the head of the operations department. He answered, Yes, Comrade General. We can't see only the routes of the right flank division's advance. They are covered by this elevation. Comcorps began the lesson by clarifying the tasks of the corps and divisions. Rosliakov accompanied his words by showing all this on the layout. Such a method was very convenient, visual, once again convinced us all that Krugliakov is a real teacher. According to the decision of the Corps commander, the divisions of the first echelon on the night of November 14th took the initial position for the offensive in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd trenches of our troops. The 290th Infantry Division, the 2nd echelon of the Corps, was concentrated 3.5 kilometres from the front line, in the 3rd position of our troops who had previously occupied the defence here. The 885th Infantry Regiment, being in the Corps Reserve, by the beginning of the artillery preparation had to be built in battalion columns on the edge of the forest, where it now occupied the initial area. With the transition to the offensive of the troops of the 1st echelon, moving after them, successively occupy and consolidate the new lines. How slowly time stretches while waiting for the offensive. Because of the dense fog, it was postponed at first from 8 hours and 15 minutes to 9. But even at 9 o'clock, the fog did not clear, and only at 10 our artillery preparation began. It lasted 40 minutes, and all this time the ground was trembling. True, sometimes this trembling decreased, seemingly getting farther away. It was our artillerymen transferred the fire into the depth of the enemy defence, hitting the 2nd echelons and reserves of the enemy. But then again, hit the front line. There were several such transfers. Yes, our commanders, starting with the counter-offensive at Stalingrad, learned to plan and conduct artillery preparation. Artillery preparation seems to be coming to an end. I'm giving the command to get ready to move. Will we move soon? Asks the deputy in the political unit, Major Yevdokimov. He just returned to the head of the column of battalions. Waiting for the signal, I replied. Bypassed the 1st and 2nd battalions, reports Yevdokimov. The mood of the men are fighting. How is the replenishment, especially Central Asians? I'm interested. Nothing, in general normal. They say we'll show the fascists too. They say they've learned to shoot, they've learned to throw grenades too, so they're just getting cold, they haven't acclimatized yet. But there are no whiners. A radio operator came up, handed me the microphone of the radio. For you, Comrade Major. 05 is speaking, I heard him. 01 ordered, road. As I understood, the reception. At the machine was the Chief of Staff of the Corps, Colonel V.Y. Rogachev. I replied that the command was accepted, understood and carried out. Immediately signalled to move. The closer we get to the front line, the stronger the noise of battle. Especially strong rumbling on the right flank. This is where one of our divisions breaks through the enemy defences along the Dnieper, in the direction of the district centre Dubrovna. The only boundary line on its right is the Dnieper River. The right neighbour is the Fifth Army behind the Dnieper. It does not conduct offensive actions, it assists only by fire from across the river. That's why it's difficult for this division. Our 290th Rifle, which is in the 2nd echelon, the Corps commander originally planned to enter the breakthrough zone of the left flank division to develop the offensive on Orsha. But the first hours of the battle showed that the offensive of the right flank division, the one that broke through the enemy's defence along the Dnieper, was about to choke, and General Krugliakov decided to put the 2nd echelon into action immediately. Therefore, and I was ordered not to stop the regiment at the line, which was to occupy our division in the initial position, and to follow directly and the first trench of his troops. The 290th Rifle, on the other hand, taking the right, began to advance to the line of attack at the junction of the divisions of the 1st echelon. Meanwhile, parts of the left flank division of the Corps continued to slowly chew through the enemy defences. On its right flank from the crest of the height, and on the left flank from the village of Kondogi, were flanking fire several heavy Nazi machine guns. In addition, in front of the fighting order of companies and battalions now and then stood a wall of barrage mortar fire. Chains of attackers then rose, overcoming this wall by throwing, then again lay down now under the flanking fire of machine guns. In the afternoon, a regiment of the 2nd echelon of this division was brought into action. The fight became even hotter. Fortunately, it was a rainy day, so the enemy aviation was inactive. Evening came, and the battle began to fade little by little. But something prepares us tomorrow, My regiment is no longer in the first trench of his troops, but a kilometre ahead of it. They occupied the trenches cleared of the enemy before us. 2 battalions were entrenched in the second, the third in the first trench. While the Deputy Chief of Staff and I went around the units, the Chief of Staff prepared a place for the NP. He located it next to a reinforced concrete Nazi pillbox, which even has a stove. By our arrival, the soldiers melted it, and now took turns drying wet uniforms, boots and shirts. Major Evdokimov and I decided to dry ourselves too. Having taken off our overcoats and spreading them on the bunks against the stove, we began to take off our boots. At that time, someone outside loudly asked the regiment commander. With difficulty, I pulled the boot that had been removed back on my foot and jumped out of the pillbox. Asked the sentry. Who asked me? Some commander. Where is he? I went that way, along the trench. The sentry pointed to the left. I wanted to go back to the shelter and scold the Chief of Staff there for not setting the password and recall, when muffled voices were heard in the trench. Several men appeared on the left, moving toward us. The one walking in front was illuminating the bottom of the trench with a pocket flashlight. "Here, I think, here," he said, and let a short man in a soldier's raincoat pass in front of him. "Where is the regimental commander?" asked this man, in whom I recognized the corps commander. I withdrew and invited him into our shelter. I tried to let him pass ahead of me. "No," protested Comcorps. "You go first and I will follow you." When we entered the pillbox, Kruglov looked at it, came to the stove, stretched out both hands to it and asked, "Weren't you waiting?" Without demanding an answer, took off his trench coat, handed it to the adjutant standing at the door. I suggested that he sit down at the table. Krugliakov lowered himself down on the semblance of a bunk we had built, ordered the adjutant to unfold the map, and when it was unfolded, he leaned over it, and as if by the way said, "Everything happens, Comrade Homolo. If you have me, it means that it is necessary. Do you have a radio station?" I reported that there was a radio station, and even a telephone connection with the division. And if necessary, through the commander's switchboard, you can contact the corps headquarters. At first, I thought that the commander would not stay with me for long. He would just hear my report on the situation and go to his observation post. But when I heard his conversation with the Chief of Staff of the Corps on the phone, I realized that he came to me for a long time. For Krugliakov said into the phone, "I'll be here at Komolo's. If the master calls, tell him that I am in front and personally manage the battle. Report all the situation to me here." That was the end of his conversation with the Corps Chief of Staff. "Homolo, give me the radio," ordered Comcorps after a short pause. The radio operator immediately put the radio station on the table in front of him. "And where are the working waves?" Krugliakov asked him. The radio operator replied that he had them only for his division and battalions. Then the general ordered the adjutant to request the necessary ones from the corps headquarters and deliver them here by mail by morning. In the meantime, I hinted to General Krugliakov that I have communication with battalion commanders only by radio, and there is only one, this one on the table. "So what?" looked up at me Comcorps. "I will have nothing to manage battalions in battle." "We'll work on one. How can you do it?" the general asked the radio operator. "It's hard, Comrade General," the latter replied. "It's nothing. We'll get out of it somehow. And where is your chief of communications?" The commander turned to me again. "I'm here, Comrade General," Captain Parshikov answered from the street. "Call Captain on the phone division commanders, but not all of them. I don't need your commander yet." Captain Parshikov sat down at the telephone.